On this week's episode of Campus Countdown, we'll be talking about three big stories campus reform covered over the last week, including a virtual die-in protest in favor of implementing stricter COVID policies, defund the police initiatives making life on campus feel a lot less safe for students, an admissions counselor actually admitting to anti-Republican bias when reviewing college applications, and our woke tweet of the week. We have a great show planned for you today. I'm Peter Cordi, and you're watching Campus Countdown. In our number 3 story of the week, students at Kent State University staged a virtual die-in protest where participants would simulate being dead from COVID and take pictures of this to post on Instagram and Twitter. Protesters held a video call through Microsoft Teams to voice their opinions on the university's response to the pandemic. One student called the university's COVID policies a sorry excuse of a response and said, "In reality, we as students should not have to be here today demanding that our school care about us, but alas, we live in a capitalistic society." Another student complained that the unvaccinated get to roam the university consequence-free, while the rest of us have to worry about staying safe when we have all done our part. The school policy mandates the vaccine with limited exemptions and requires masks to be worn indoors regardless of vaccination status. If these students are vaccinated like 69% of the student body and 82% of KSU employees on top of wearing their masks, why are they so afraid of those who made a private and personal decision about what to inject into their own body? One professor at the school even encouraged, quote, radical activist tactics, citing previous protests that shut down the New York Stock Exchange, disrupted World Health Organization summits, and in one case, stormed the National Institutes of Health. We've been hearing for the last year that storming government buildings is the wrong thing to do during a protest, but the rules never have applied to both sides, have they? As bizarre as this virtual die-in protest was, it was initially slated to be held in person at the university quad, but inclement weather deprived the world of that ridiculousness. Moving on to our second article of the week, the city of Austin, Texas defunded their police force in 2020 and made its campus a terrifying place for students. Here to tell us about it is Arkansas campus correspondent Blakely Fiedler. Tell us what's happening at UT Austin, Blakely.
Thanks, Peter. For our number 2 story of the week, the city of Austin, Texas defunded its police force in the summer of 2020, leading students at UT Austin to sound off about how they feel unsafe on campus, citing a number of crimes committed on and near the school. The University of Texas Police Department made the decision to increase security on campus, but the school doesn't have nearly the budget required to match what the city has already taken away. One student told Campus Reform about his friend, whose car was broken into on campus. Instead of the 911 emergency line sending an officer to evaluate the damage, he was redirected to the 311 non-emergency police number. According to the student, the officer allegedly took ages to arrive at the scene, a concern echoed by many other students at the university, and were reportedly not helpful at all when assessing the situation. Especially for young female students like myself, the thought of not having enough police members to respond if I were in a crisis is frightening. Even walking from my car in the parking lot to my apartment building in Fayetteville, Arkansas, I make sure I'm always on the phone with a friend. But I also know that because of the measure of safety that my apartment takes, if it were an emergency, I am confident that the response time would be fast. The young ladies at UT Austin unfortunately cannot say the same. It's safe to say that one of the top fears of a young woman on campus is being jumped and raped. You never think it'll happen to you until you hear it happen to another student. Yet hundreds of sex offenders in Austin will no longer be monitored by the police department, including one person who molested an autistic teenager. The young women on the UT campus are right to feel like their safety has been compromised. Back to you, Peter.
Thanks, Blakely. In our number 1 story of the week, an admissions counselor at Clemson University, home of the Tigers, said the quiet part out loud, admitting her anti-Republican bias in a Snapchat post. She wrote as she was reviewing college applications, and I quote, "If you're going to talk about being a Republican, 1, don't act like it's an oppressed group because it's not, and 2, unless you actively denounce the white supremacy and misogyny within your own party, you are going out of your way to identify with an oppressive group." This is someone who influences who does or does not get admitted at Clemson, and she calls the Republican Party, of which almost half the country belongs, an oppressive group, and alleges widespread white supremacy and misogyny within the party while claiming it's not an oppressed group. When Democrats have to actively denounce their party's long history of slavery, Jim Crow, and segregation, not to mention the Trail of Tears and Japanese internment camps, and I can go on, then maybe it would be fair to ask Republicans to denounce the racists and sexists in their own party. Last time I checked, Republicans aren't the ones pushing racist narratives like critical race theory, positing that certain ethnic groups are inherently oppressors while others are inherently oppressed. And to say that the Republican Party is not a marginalized group as a university employee is laughable. CampusReform.org is full of examples of liberal abuse by college faculty, staff, and students against Republicans and conservatives. This is one of those examples. And speaking of people pushing racist narratives, our woke tweet of the week comes from Nicole Hannah-Jones, who took to Twitter to brag about how she gave a speech and tricked the audience into thinking the most radical and divisive cherry-picked quotes from Martin Luther King Jr. were her own words before her big reveal. She wrote, "I was invited to give an MLK speech today, and a small number of members of the group hosting me wrote and then leaked emails opposing my giving this speech, as it dishonored Dr. King for me to do so. They called me a discredited activist, unworthy of such association with King. So, I scrapped my original speech and spent the entire first half of it reading examples from a bunch of Dr. King's speeches, but without telling anyone that I was doing so, leading the audience to think King's words were mine. And woo child, it was amazing." What's amazing is that she thought this was some kind of accomplishment. It's not that hard to use copy and paste. Jones is a proponent of the 1619 Project, whose central claims have been thoroughly debunked by scholars. One such claim is the idea that the American colonists declared their independence from Britain because they wanted to protect the institution of slavery. The 1619 Project is a reimagining, a revision of true history, a history that already included very real examples of institutional racism. Nicole Hannah-Jones is called a discredited activist because her activism is built on a foundation of falsehoods mixed in with those very real truths, but she uses these lies to promote her divisive ideology. If you've ever heard her speak, it basically goes something like this: white people are terrible, and white people who don't admit this are worse. The quotes she chose to use from Martin Luther King Jr. were indeed critical of white people and capitalism, but keep in mind, he was talking about race relations of 60 years ago. Have we not made so much progress since Dr. King's assassination? And she cherry-picked his most radical quotes, but those quotes were indeed said. And this actually doesn't make the point Jones thinks it's making, because in reality, if people knew more about Dr. King, they would realize that he, like all of us, was a fallible human being, speaking from his own point of view that was shared by millions around the world. But if Jones thought that she could justify her ideology with out-of-context plagiarism, she's more out of touch with reality than previously thought. Well, that's all we have for you today. If you're watching on YouTube, be sure to like, comment, and subscribe. Check out our social media platforms and campusreform.org for all the latest liberal lunacy being pushed on campus.